All right, we are going to get started here. So good afternoon and welcome to the Osterville Village Library. My name is Amy Wolf and I'm the programming director here at the OVL. Thank you for joining us today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today we have retired Coast Guard Captain Greg Ketchen here with us to talk about a history of lighthouses from conception to present day. This was a long time in the making because I enjoy Greg's lectures so much, and there were so many to choose from. I am very happy that he agreed to the Lighthouse talk. Greg Ketchen is a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain living in Osterville. He is a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum located in Barnstable's old customs house and has served as its president. Before moving to Cape, Greg's career included providing support to Massachusetts commercial ports as a development consultant, heading operations at the New England Aquarium and filling a wide variety of Coast Guard jobs. These included performing duties at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, completing assignments as chief oceanographer for the International Ice Patrol, and on the faculty of the Coast Guard Academy and serving as commander of Coast Guard Group Boston and a NATO station in Italy. He has completed graduate studies in both physical oceanography and business administration. He is a frequent lecturer on a variety of topics related to Coast Guard missions and history. And he is today your special guest speaker for Lighthouses. So without further ado, Greg Ketchen.
Thank you. Thank you. This is on. That's one. That's on now. Okay. And among all those things, it's interesting. It's hard to believe I went through that much stuff, but I can't sing or dance. So I'm asking. I have not that talent. As you heard, I spent 31 years in the Coast Guard on active duty, and it was a very demanding, very challenging, but very rewarding career. Then when I got out, I kept on, as she said, I've been president of the Coast Guard Heritage Center over in Barnstable's Village for the last, it's about 10 years now, 8 or 9, I've lost track of a lot. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But just a forewarning, one of the things with PowerPoint is that, at least on my computer, I put my notes in there to read from the notes. Well, I can't do that with this computer, I just discovered. So I'll be completely spontaneous. Forgive me if I mess up a date. My notes are here, which is just a little, which isn't much. I'm not even going to read those, but if I get some things I may forget. So having said that, since I don't have to be at the computer, I will stand up for a while. But as some of you are aware, as you age, your back doesn't hold out as well as you would hope. So I may.
You can adjust here, but just make sure you switch the slide there.
Yeah, this. Hold on, sure, this doesn't do it either. The problem talking. So let's get started. Let me get up here first. Now, none of you can probably guess what this light is, right? You weren't paying attention. I spent quite a bit of time at this light. It's a Portland headlight, as pointed out, which was named after Amy. Or it's the other way around. Portland headlight is built in the 1790s, 1791, as I recall. And it was well, we talk, I have this problem talking to the mic. It is a historic light for many, many reasons. A lot of things have happened here. The problem I have today is that there are about 50,000 lighthouses in the world, and well over 1,000 major lighthouses in the United States. Amy said, try to keep it in the 1,000. Don't try to get to the 50,000 mark. Actually, there are 13 lighthouses on Cape Cod. Even that would take much more lecture. So I'm not going to be able to touch on everything. So save questions. I'm just going to give stories of things that I experienced with lighthouse. I think you'll find much of them interesting. But I want to start out with a little bit of history on instructed me on how to do this.
Down.
Okay, it was
Down is forward. Oh, here, hold on. There you go.
okay. Now you can see here, lighthouses come on at night. That's the first step. This is the museum. I'm not going to dwell a lot on other things other than lighthouses, but I need to give a little bit of introduction. For those that are not familiar with the Coast Guard, there are so many missions that we have, which makes it exciting, challenging, but so many missions. And that's celebrated here at the Customs House. Part of the reason that we're in the Customs House now, it was available 20 years ago, but this is where the headquarters for the Customs Office was back in 1800s. And the Coast Guard and the Lighthouse Service and the Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service and the Customs were all under the Department of the Treasury, initially under Hamilton. Thus, it was very appropriate for us to go back in there. Matter of fact, when new keepers came up for light stations, the senior customs officer would usually be the one that appointed those people, usually with some other political input to it. But so it's appropriate, and it's a great place. So I encourage my one advertisement. I'll do one more later. I've got another project I think you might find interesting. But stop by sometime. I think you'll be personally surprised. It's not a glorified man cave with a bunch of patches and hats. It's much more than that. In fact, it's always impressive to see the amount of artifacts that we get in that are historic. These aren't just things that are 20 or 30 years old. These are things that are 200 to 300 years old in some cases, and tell the story of Cape Cod and Massachusetts is the major focus, but there are many things there. And I'm very involved and very interested in what stories we're able to tell. So, going well so far. There. Well, just quickly, Coast Guard, and this is the last, I think, a real-time photo, or almost real-time. The three big missions the Coast Guard had that started here in Massachusetts, it turned out. Massachusetts is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. MLE is Marine Law Enforcement, Maritime Law Enforcement. That includes drug interdiction, enforcement of customs, doing all sorts of everything from drunk boating to drug smugglers from other parts of the world. SAR is, for most of you are aware, search and rescue. I think many of you, when you think of Coast Guard, think of that search and rescue, small boats going out, helicopters going on rescuing people. It's a very satisfying part of the job. I had the privilege of being involved with a lot of that. But on the negative side, every once in a while you lose somebody, you just can't save them, and that's always a bad day. And ATON is short for Aids to Navigation, and that's where we're spending our time today. The first lighthouse was one in Massachusetts, still exists, Boston Light and Little Brewster Island in Boston Harbor. And that led on to the lighthouse service, the lighthouse establishment, and then finally to about 45,000 aids navigation, both floating like buoys, lighthouses, day markers, and that sort of thing. So it's grown. So enough on that. Let me go to the birth of the Coast Guard quickly. I'm adding this because I spent quite a bit of time in the last year and a half on this project. This is where it all began. Here in Newburyport was where the first revenue cutter was built in 1791. It's significant because it was the first commissioned vessel, armed vessel in the United States. The Navy had disbanded after the Revolution, and the Coast Guard was the Navy, the armed forces, until later in the 1790s when the Navy was reformed again. The Boston Light is that middle arrow, and the bottom arrow is the life-saving service, Massachusetts Humane Society. I'll just mention it once. They are not the animal people. These are people that goes back to the present, back to 1785. A great group of people and have been involved and given awards for rescue and so forth. But they were the first people to set up rescue stations and rescue huts along the coast until the Coast Guard finally, until the federal government formed the U.S. Life Saving Service after the Civil War. So that's the birth of the Coast Guard. And it's important because not many people know that this is where the Coast Guard began, including, as I said, lighthouses. These are the Massachusetts, the Boston Light, and the Humane Society. I put, hold on one second, let's see if I can get this right. I put this up in here because about 20 years ago, actually 25 years ago now, there was legislation went through the State House, both the Senate and House, to memorialize this role of the Coast Guard, not the role, but the origins of the Coast Guard here in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, it got going, fundraising started, and then certain people were transferred. The artist died, among other things. This is 25 years ago. So the thing was set aside. We started up again about 3 years ago now. So I'm serving as one of the co-chair with, some of you remember if you've been around here, Ruthie Provost is my co-chair on this. And we've got about 17 people, artists, historians, senior Coast Guard officers looking at developing this memorial. And the memorial at this stage is this way. This is a small sketch, probably 18 by 24 right now. This is the concept to get approved by the Art Commission. It is, our directions to the artist, and it's a phenomenal artist. He's one of the top maritime artists in the country, said, we want to kind of look in the drama like Washington crossing the Delaware, except better. This will be 8 feet by 8 feet and permanently installed in the State House. There'll be about 1,000 people, I'm sorry, 10,000 people a year that will view it going by this. Maybe it's even more than that. This is showing those three. Let me see if it said that I can use this as a pointer. Okay, I can. Good. This is that Mass Humane Society rescue boat, search and rescue. This is the Massachusetts here that was interdicting drugs and so forth, or illegal stuff coming into the country. And then Boston Light is in the center. On the far distance here, and it's hard to see because this is, again, a rough sketch. When it's through, this is going to be spectacular. The artist is fantastic. It will be an oil on canvas. He's from Mystic, Connecticut, a guy named Russ Kramer. It will be awe-inspiring. This will be a legacy painting, not just for the Commonwealth and for the artist, but for the Coast Guard too. So we're very excited about that. Not cheap, $200,000 by the time we get through with it. This is these are top level artists involved in it. It's a major painting. This last week we took a paper copy, a black and white paper copy, expanded the smaller version we had into a larger version, and just taped up on the wall to see how it would look in the spot that we're going to have for it. Just outside the Hall of Flags, if you know the Great Hall, as you come up in the elevator, it'll be the first thing you see. So it's exciting, except it will be it'll be colored. Black and white doesn't quite grab you quite as much. So why do we have Lighthouse to begin with? Let me get now cut to the chase and get to lighthouses. Initially, lighthouses, these are lighthouses in 2 or 3 millennia ago. We're just marking where a port was located. So in the Mediterranean, lighthouses are up high. They can be seen for 40, 50, 60 miles away if they had a large enough fire and draw them into the port. It wasn't for navigation purposes or for hazards. They would that came later. Lighthouses today, I should point out, I don't mean to be a downer on it, they really don't have much navigational value anymore. With GPS and other forms of navigation, lighthouses don't have much, but they have some navigational value. If I get to it at the end, I'll talk about a ship grounding just off Cape Cod a while ago, 30 years ago, that was all the modern conveniences as far as navigation. Still want to ground there within sight of a lighthouse. They should have, a classmate, a friend of mine, Coast Guard captain also, was assigned as the investigating officer. And this is the Royal Majesty. It was the ship that used to go, so I think it still does, from Boston to Bermuda and back every week. But it ran aground coming up on Cape Cod, and they were within sight of Skankety Lighthouse on Martha's Vineyard. And a friend, a guy named Captain Turlow, did the investigation and went to a press conference afterward and said, went through all the problems. There was a problem electronically. There was a misconnection. A brand new vessel, as this is in the 90s. But he said, all that said, and there was some electrical failures and some human error too. But he said, every once in a while, you need to look out the window because a lighthouse is right there in sight of them. They should have caught that. So anyway, why do we have lighthouses? Well, today, lighthouses, up until 20 years ago, they're providing navigational assistance, so it was invaluable. And certainly all during the 1800s and the early 1900s, they were classic. But today, frankly, lighthouses are just iconic. Their stability, they're historic. They're great. I love them. I mean, I think that most of them are now being preserved, and that's great. Let me go back a few years, I hope. This was 300, I don't have my notes here, but I think it was 300 BC, the lighthouse at Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile. And it is really determined, some have determined to be the first lighthouse, but there's discussion of a lighthouse 2,000 years before this in India that was a lighthouse. Now, what is a lighthouse is another question. If you put a bonfire on the beach, is that a lighthouse? Well, you could, and that's what a lot of people would do with their sons and daughters or husbands were out fishing. that started a bonfire at the beach at the end of the day to guide them back into the port. But these are considered, this one of the wonders of the ancient world, along with this other one, another wonder of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes. Again, not really representing hazards or more, they're just saying, here's our port. In fact, they would send small boats out into the maybe 20 or 30 miles offshore to visit or to interact with some of the vessels coming in, primarily because they were just telling them, we're not under siege right now. That was an often problem. If they left from someplace, they come into a port like Alexandria, they want to make sure it's a safe port to come into. So the port would send out people and even provide assistance getting into the port. This one didn't last a whole long time. I'll go back. This one lasts, as I recall, 1,600 years. It finally, I think it was fairly recently, 1700s, it finally was down. Maybe it was a little older than that, but it wasn't that long ago. So it was well built. Going on, this is obviously modern. I put this up just to show you the sort of traffic. This was the interstate highway system, if you will, back in the 18 and 1700s. Traffic coming out of Boston up here, coming down along the Cape, traffic coming out of Salem, all go down along here, and it was treacherous. So needed, finally they realized they had to put some lighthouses. So the sailors and sea captains and crews were on their own until at least the early 1700s. I mean, there was nothing there to respond if they went aground and were wrecked. There was no one there to go out and assist them. But finally it became clear, particularly when we became a new nation, that we needed to provide some assistance. And that's Massachusetts took the lead in this with search and rescue and law enforcement and so forth. But this is the route. So you can imagine vessels coming out of here, particularly on a stormy night, coming down here, not having anything here to look at, easily run aground. It was a Peaks Bar shoals are right here. It's a common place for vessels to run aground, and then just to the east of Provincetown. And then, of course, you had the major channels coming out of New York and so forth coming across here. But this was the challenge. How do you get past Nantucket Shoals? It gobbled up many ships in a day, and it was always shifting. So you might say, oh, I know where the sandbars are. No, you don't. A major storm comes through and the sandbars would shift to someplace else. And even though they may be sand, even if you're a big ship going into sand, it exposes you to heavy waves. So that the rock that you hit on the coast of Maine can be even less dangerous than the waves hitting you and breaking you apart on the coast of Massachusetts. This was considered the graveyard of the Atlantic, of North Atlantic. There are many graveyards in North Atlantic. There's one down in the Bahamas. There was another one in around North Carolina, obviously, and then Sable Island, which is further off, was a graveyard. So, apologize. I'm probably missing some things here, but I'll cover most of it. There were a lot of innovations that occurred. In fact, I was going to introduce this a little bit more that made things a little bit better. One is the Pilgrims, particularly, and then a few years later, the Sparrowhawk came across from England. They knew somewhat of where they were, but not very well. Essentially, you're there when you run aground. The Pilgrims were heading down to Virginia, as you probably recall, and ended up in Provincetown initially, then over in Plymouth. Those are my ancestors. My ancestors came over on the Mayflower, but they were good writers and religious people, but they weren't very good farmers and fishermen and so forth. Fortunately, I brought some people on that could do that. But in the 1700s, one of the problems with navigation is not knowing longitude. Latitude, on a clear day, at least not when you could get the sun and the moon, you could figure out what your latitude was, north and south. You had very little clue of where you were east and west, unless you were fairly accurate in keeping track, which I try to do as much as possible. Waves and current, hard to determine where you are east and west. So eventually you get to the coast, and if it's a dark and stormy night, you run aground. But this guy, John Harrison, in the 1700s in England, developed the chronometer. That made all the difference. I won't go into slush and navigation. I'll really bore you if I get into that. But slush and navigation is based on having a point of reference. And that point of reference at the time was in Greenwich, England. And all the star sightings were based on that. So if you know your time within seconds of being away from Greenwich, east or west, you could calculate your longitude. And that's what Harrison did. I won't dwell on this too much longer. When we get to lighthouses again, these are some of the clocks he developed, and they were very, very precise and taken aboard ship to do navigation. The other innovation was the Fresnel lens, as some people would pronounce it Fresnel lens, but it's a French lens, so it's Fresnel lens. The Fresnel lens was a major innovation. Mr. Fresnel was a physicist, prism maker, and so in the early 1800s, I'm sorry, in the early 1822, he finally developed this Fresnel lens that focused, as you can see here. It's hard to show, but it took a light source, might be a light source. Oops, not a light source. Took a light source in here, a bulb or a fire or whatever it might be. And instead of going out globally all over the place, it focused the light to go out in one direction. And that really increased the intensity of light. So even in some cases, 10 times or more intense of light by doing a Fresnel lens. The problem was the Americans, first of all, couldn't afford the lenses for their lights. And second of all, they really thought that they the War of 1812 and other things were occurring. French had been allies for a while. They just said, we'll just do our own. Well, they couldn't do it anywhere. Finally, about before the Civil War, they came to the conclusion that we probably should buy some of these, and it made a world of difference. I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's very hard to show here. We have some displays at the museum, but show how the lens operates and some pieces of lens, but they're impressive. This is a first order lens, means it's about 12 feet tall and about 6 feet across. They're really spectacular. As a historian and a guy that enjoys artifacts in our archive, what happened back in the 50s is these lights were automated, and then these very good plastic lenses occurred that would have the similar optic. So the seamen would go out with these plastic lenses fairly light, and they would replace them, and then they'd take the Fresnel lens and just throw them over the cliff because it was quite a long trip back. So we lost many of them. Fortunately, not a large percentage of them, but these lenses now will sell for a sun this size, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're spectacular. Not just their value monetarily, but just their appearance. You can see this one is spectacular. There is one called the hyper lens. This is first order. Hyper lens is one that is on Oahu in Hawaii that has a range there, phenomenal range. It's about 2 or 3 times. You can get 3 or 4 people inside this lens if you choose to. I'm not sure why you want to, but let me go on here a little bit. This is the start of the modern lighthouse era, where we're trying to mark hazards of navigation. Let me see if I can. Well, I probably can't on here. I'm not quite sure how it's done. I was gonna, some of you probably can, my wife could do it, sing along to this, the Eddystone Light by the Brothers Four. You remember that song. But this was in 1696, I think. Eddystone built in open water just south of the mouth of the Thames, about 10 or 12 miles south, as I recall. And it was the first modern lighthouse that in this very harsh environment. There were other lighthouses that were existing to mark, or day markers are put up, but this is one that was, you can see how harsh it is. If you look carefully, you can see that there's a light keeper standing right here. You can kind of see him in here too. But it's a fairly famous shot of Eddystone Light. We followed up with that. I'll show you that in a second with our own lights. Oh, this. Oh, you got the gist of it. Most of us here probably remember this song. I'll let it go for another minute or so. One more verse. Maybe not. I won't go to that. So let's get back to local lights. We have a number of them on the Cape, and most of them you can get to, and they are, I mean, I'm a little prejudiced, they're all spectacular. I mean, almost every lighthouse I love the look of, with a few exceptions. This is Highland Light. The name was changed to Cape Cod Light back in the 70s for some reason, but most people still call it Highland Light. It was built in 1797 as again, at the end of Washington's first administration, he authorized it. He had moved on before it was built, but it is a spectacular light. Initially, though, construction under this new lighthouse service that came in was lacking. Again, there wasn't much money to do it, and many of the structures were wooden, and they, including this light. This is the light that was built. I think it was finally in this stage in the 1850s, and it's up fairly high. It's on a bluff that's about 160 feet tall, and the light itself is another 125 feet, I think, to the focal lens. So that means, your height. Some people believe in a flat Earth, but it's not flat. I think all of you understand. Curvature of the Earth depends on what your height of eye is, and this one, because it's up so high, and for a large ship off, it could had a range on a clear night of 75 miles. It could go out to sea. Once they put a Fresnel lens in there in 1855 and had electricity there to amplify the light even more, it was one of the longest range lights in the world. Probably exceeded, at least the United States, only by the one in Hawaii. So it's a spectacular history. It's been moved several times. When they first got the light, it was 400, and my memory is correct, 450 feet away from the bluff, this 160-foot bluff. By 1990, that had decreased to about 100 feet, and it was time to move it. So they moved it back about 500 feet or 450 feet back in the 90s, and that's a whole interesting process. So we have just got through doing one done in at the end of Long Island. I forget whether it was Montauk or but I should remember that. But it was it's a process that can move these lighthouses, and they're not the lighthouses built later in the 1800s and early 1900s were much better built masonry, and that means they're heavy to move. So this is I won't go through all the history of this particular light, but then you can visit and get the history there. But it's our light, meaning Cape Cod Light. We have ones closer to home. There's one over in Sandy Neck, a small light there marking the entrance that used to be a fairly significant commercial harbor back in the 1800s, to the ones, the Hyannis Light and some others just in the South Shore, smaller lights. And of course, outside of Barnesville, there's Knobska Light and many others. But this one is the first and still the tallest one in Cape Cod. I put this in, obviously it's not a photograph, but just to indicate, led into this with song. There's so many things about lighthouses that are fascinating. A lot of books have been written, a lot of movies that have been done about lighthouses, and paintings been done. This was, my mom grew up in Needham, Mass, and went to Newton Wellesley Hospital. And one of her classmates at Newton Wellesley Hospital back in the 40s was an amateur artist, but we used to come to the Cape with that family every summer, and she did this of Nauset Light. And this was before it was moved for the third time, Nauset Light. But I'm putting this up for a couple of reasons. One, I'll get to here in a second, but I'll point out the characteristic of the light, the look of the light, red on the top, white in the bottom. I'll get back to that later if I remember. But many lighthouses have served as piece of art. One of the lighthouses that I was very familiar with under my command was up in Portland, Maine. Nubble Light in Cape Nettic was one of our lights. And Nubble Light was, again, one of the more photographed lights around and painted lights around, but it had a chain link fence around the yard that had the keeper had put years and years ago for keep his dogs in, whatever, which seemed like it'd be negative. It was, I think, to most people. But the problem was that people would do paintings of it and put the chain link fence in the painting. But then when we decided to change it to a nice picket fence, there was an uproar on the art community. They said, well, you're really dating our art now by all our art shows the chain link fence, and we've got it there, and you've changed the whole thing. So, geez, a picket fence is much prettier than a chain link fence, but it's amazing. The artists tend to be, I can speak this way because I'm not an artist, they tend to be fickle about their art. But this is in our, I hate to say, in our bathroom at home. It's been there for quite a while in Osterville. Movies. This is a novel, actually. This is a a movie. Some of you may be familiar with this one. The Lightkeeper is with. Didn't do particularly well in the box office, but it was with obviously Blythe Danner, Richard Dreyfuss, even Bruce Dern was in it, Mamie Gummer, and others were in this. Filmed here in Cape Cod. In fact, we were down there, I think it was 2008 when they were filming in Osterville and Dowses Beach. So we were able to watch a little bit. It wasn't publicized, though. We happened to stumble across it. It was interesting to see how they're doing it film. And the film, if you haven't seen the film, being Cape Codders, it's kind of fun to see it, but it wasn't, it didn't come close to any sort of an Academy Award. It didn't involve sharks either, so that kept the crowds down. Okay, the lighthouse service. I mentioned Aton before. This is the original lighthouse. Boston Light, built in 1716, America's first lighthouse site. I had to put it in there because it's not America's oldest lighthouse, because it was burned down at least twice during the Revolution, first by the Americans and by the British. So unlikely named light. I just talked about erosion and so forth. The oldest lighthouse in the country is Sandy Hook Light in New Jersey. It's on a granite bluff. It's not going to go anywhere. So it's not like Cape Cod where it gets eaten back and so forth. But this we usually consider America's first lighthouse. And it was rebuilt very early. Actually, I think it was finished before Washington actually took office, sometime in the late 1780s, after the Revolution was done. But it's in Little Brewster Island. It marks the entrance to Boston Harbor. It's always been an important navigational light, but also historically. It is the last lighthouse to be unstaffed. Sally Snowman, a good friend of mine, I consider a good friend, she was in the Coast Guard when I had command up in Boston, so I got to know her fairly well there. But she was the last lightkeeper. She was assigned to be a lightkeeper there for about 20 years. She was a Coast Guard auxiliarist and was hired and paid to be the lightkeeper. But she finally now, a year and a half ago, I think, was when she was finally decided that they want to undo it, have the staff taken off. Just as an aside, it was Ted Kennedy that passed legislation when he was still alive that said Boston Light will never be automated. It's historic. Well, he passed away, as you know, and they automated it. So it's still part of our, as I mentioned to you earlier, this one aid to navigation has now ballooned into 45,000 roughly aids to navigation around the country. It's a great, one of the oldest artifacts is out there was a signal cannon, fog signal that was made in 1600. Although Sally has corrected me on that before. She said, well, actually, that may be the oldest, but it wasn't moved there until just before the Civil War. But anyway, it sounds a little nice to say it's the oldest artifact. Been out there many, many times, and it's still available to go out to. There are boats that will take you out. I keep track of my time here. These are the Three Sisters. I think some of you are aware of Three Sisters. I point this out because once the navigation got a little bit better, once Harrison had the clock all perfected and they could fit latitude, you still had difficulty, particularly if it was stormy, rainy, cloudy, of determining your position. So when they came up on a lighthouse, they needed to determine which lighthouse is this. I don't know. They all kind of look the same. So they tried to make them look different. The first effort on Nauset was to put the Three Sisters up, the three different lighthouses, the three different lenses fairly close together, or three different lights. And they come in and say, oh, that's the Three Sisters. I know where I am. I need to go either north or south from here, or I'm going to run into Cape Cod. But there are other ones. These are some of the other lights. You can see the different, I mentioned before, the Nauset light that had a red top to it, a white bottom. Skankety had a light center, and there are all sorts of variations on it. They would also do two lights together, three lights. You saw not the lighthouse out at Chatham was two lights at one point, or were two lights. I said they actually moved one of them up, took the place of the Three Sisters. So the lighthouse up in Nauset now that you see, this one with a red top, was originally down in Chatham as two lights right next to one there. It's identical. The two are identical. It just moved up. Moved up is in this misnomer. It was actually disassembled and brought up and reassembled up there. So that's, but you can see this was Thatcher Island, two lights there, again, to help identify it, but also it turns out they're in north-south alignment. So the captains coming in could address or calibrate their compass and see there was north-south. Once the two were in line, they knew they were in north-south line at that point. So again, each of these lights, I could spend an hour or two talking about, and I won't. There's just not time. This is Split Rock. This is in Two Harbors. Where is Two Harbors? My notes would tell it's somewhere down in the Georgia, North Carolina area. But again, it's a tall, all white. The height would tell people fairly recognizable. St. Augustine light, stripes. This is a light in England. That one. One of our problems with this coastline was we're all familiar with nor'easters. Nor'easters. This is my crude attempt to show a cyclone. Part of my graduate work was one of the degrees was in physical oceanography and meteorology. So we study this all the time. I try to simplify it here, which doesn't always work. But this is the northeastern, low sitting out there. The wind's coming down in this direction out of, as you would guess, out of northeast. Well, if you're a vessel coming up the coast here, the old square rig vessels could go into the wind some, but they couldn't go much into the wind. So as they're coming up here, if they get caught here, they would be driven ashore right here. And that's what led to all the shipwrecks. They had to really try to keep a wide berth to go out further out here so they could be set back into Boston. But it was a treacherous area, not just because of the storms and the winds and the fog. It was because of the bottom would grab you. This is a particularly, let me just take, hold on, I'm out of sequence here a little bit. Let me go back in here. So vessels going from Boston down to New York or the Mid-Atlantic would come out of here, come out of Salem, and they'd hug the coast down here. It was quite a ways around. This is a continental shelf out here. The shoals down here, Nauset Light was way down in this area down here. So it was hard to, it was impossible to cut across here. There were too many shoals. So what they could do is work their way down through Nantucket Sound, come down through to the west of Martha's Vineyard, and then they'd break free and go all the way south there. And it became a common route. In fact, we marked it very carefully with lighthouses, but in most places, lighthouses couldn't be built there because the land wasn't close enough. So they had light ships. Light ships is essentially a floating lighthouse. And this was considered Lighthouse Alley. There were as many as 12 to 15 engaged lighthouses to guide people through. Well, this next example is one that wasn't successful. This was the city of Columbus, and it came down by Nobska, it came down the canal to the west of Martha's Vineyard, and then ran aground on a shoal. That's the lighthouse at the end of at the southwest corner of Martha's Vineyard, shown on the cliff here. This is the rescue boats here are life-saving. I mean, the Mass Humane Society boats, primarily staffed and manned by Native Americans at the time. So they're out there, and these right here. I need more practice with this, obviously. Going the wrong way. I'm sorry. I was trying to point here. These are all rescue boats in here, rescue boats over here. The lighthouse was the first. This occurred in the middle of the night. He didn't see the wreck out there until early the next morning, then got all his crews out, I mean, the life-saving service and so forth out to help out. Just happened that the Dexter, revenue cutter Dexter, was going by later in the morning and helped rescue several people anyway. What I love about this picture, though, is these three organizations, the Revenue Cutter Service, the Lighthouse Service, and the Life-Saving Service, or what was the Mass Humane Society here, all merged together in the early 20th century to become the Coast Guard. This is a picture of the Coast Guard before it became the Coast Guard. All three are represented here. The tragedy with this particular vessel was there were about 120 people on board, and less than 20 survived. And all the women and children, this was packed with women and children, they're coming out of Boston, going down to Charles, Morehead City, somewhere down in Charleston, Morehead City. And it wasn't that the crews weren't heroic in doing certain things. They got all the women and children on deck to move them into lifeboats. And at that point, a large wave came over, washed them out. So all the women and children died. Some of the crew and the men survived, not because they were trying to hide it, but they were they were trying to get other things ready. So it was a tragic event. This was probably one of the biggest events, maritime disasters, up until the Titanic. This was in the 1880s. Titanic, because it was close by. There was the New York press and so forth involved. But lighthouses played a role here, but they didn't watch it close enough. This is Boone Island Light. I'll sit for a second. Mention Boone Island Light. Anyone here familiar with Boone Island Light? It's about 6 or 7 miles off of North Beach in Maine. It's as you can see, a solo light, very low profile shoals, and extreme high tide. Much of the island is underwater. It's only 12 feet or so, maybe a little bit more than that, up until the lighthouse. It was famous back in the early 1700s for a crew British crew that was wrecked there and went on board. And they were there, 14 people on board, 4 of them died, and then they were there for 24 days, and they had no food. They reverted to cannibalism. So it got its notoriety there by that. Actually, it was the carpenter had died many weeks before. They decided they just needed some food. Pretty gruesome, but they didn't have a lot of choice. Except died themselves. The Boone Island is. I lived up there for in my Coast Guard career, right in New York for a while. You can look out at Boone Island. And my cousin was involved in automating it in 1978. So I'm very familiar with it. Again, the whole story on its own, but it's just a very interesting light. It is the tallest lighthouse in New England, I believe. Not the highest, because it's right at the water level. It's not the highest lighthouse, but the tower itself goes up quite a ways. Let me move back on camera, I guess. This is a surprise, for example, a surprise of getting music and so forth. I'm not quite sure what to expect with this, but we'll go with it. Seguin Island Light. I have a lot of stories. When I was active at this time in the 70s and 80s, many of these lights were still staffed, still had people on board. And Seguin Island is on the mouth of the Kennebec River, south of Bath, Maine. It's a fantastic light. First order lens up top, you can see there, really spectacular lens, Fresnel lens up in here. After it was automated, I went there with friends and we camped out there a few nights, and very, very windy. We thought we actually lost somebody. We didn't see his tent when we got up in the morning. Turned out he folded up and went inside the lighthouse, which is a wise thing to do. But Seguin, with the light keepers, very often they have, particularly if it's a solo light, in some case one person there, they tend to get a little challenged, I think. They used to call them wacky wickies. The wiki is the wick of the light, and wacky because they're a little strange. But there are other reasons that they were strange. And not the case here in Seguin Island. The lightkeepers there would come to me and said, Captain, I know the place is haunted. I've heard several times a Model T Ford, this is in the 70s, pulling up. There is no road on it. It's an island way offshore. I hear a Model T Ford pulling up to the front door. I go out and there's nobody there, but I'm sure it's haunted. So okay, thank you. Maybe you should take a couple of weeks off and come ashore. But what the more serious problem is when we got the Fresnel lenses now and could focus it, we would rotate the light so it provided a characteristic flash. So you could say not only could identify it as 2 lights or 3 lights, but say this flashes every 10 seconds, which was the characteristic of Boston light, flashed every 10 seconds. And other lights flash different ways. And to do this, they would take the lens, which is very heavy, and put it in a bath of mercury. So the friction, it would support obviously very heavy, and they then could rotate the light through mechanics. They didn't have to stand there rotating the light, but there would be spillages and so forth. I know as a kid growing up, you probably went through the whole thing. You'd take mercury in your hand, roll it around and so forth until we really understood the toxicity. Wacky wickies were actually the people that they would not ingest it, but just the fumes after 2 or 3 years out there, and they were wacky. I mean, called mental illness by ingesting that. So that's not a glorious story, but that's one of the hardships. There are many hardships. Let me see if there's a couple more here I can show. Oh, this is one of the characteristics of the lights. This was, does the shape remind you of anything? They were nicknamed this. They call it a spark plug light. Looks like a spark plug. This was in Spring Point Light in Portland. my wife and friends, since I was up there in charge of these lights, there was no one stuff that had all been automated. I had a key, so we go up there and with a picnic for the fireworks and the 4th of July and watch the picnic. They used to Peaks Island and Cushing Island off in the distance. Actually, I think Cushing Island's further over to the right, but it was a great little. It has a breakwater went out to it, but it was the entrance to Portland Harbor, Squirrel Point Light. I mean, Spring Point Light. This is the one in Situate. It was disestablished many years ago, but in the 90s, they decided to reestablish. The community thought they wanted to have it lit again. So they went through the effort of lighting it, but they didn't want to shine out at sea because it wasn't an aid to navigation anymore. It didn't want to confuse people. So I remember going to the ceremony that we really, it must have been 95, 96 that we relit it. But what's interesting about this, and I'll show you another example here in a second. These lights are in very exposed areas typically, and particularly the ones that were built in the early part of the 1800s didn't last a whole long time. They would get washed away. This one, the first 16 feet or so of it is stone pieced together, and the top is wood. But it's also not sitting on a foundation at all. It's actually sitting on what they call beach shingles. It goes down only about 3 feet, and it survived very well. Just right thing at the right time. I digress here for a second about the inside of lighthouses. When the lighthouses were wooden, they'd bring the oil up to, because there were oil, permanent whale oil, to light the wicks and so forth, get the wicks burning. And the way up on these wooden steps that spill a little oil by mistake, then this oil would seep in. That was not good for fire hazard. So a lot of these lighthouses burned down because it would get, I don't know if any lightkeeper was killed by it, but it would take out the light. Another interesting fact, nothing to do with what the story is just telling about the stairs going up. In most forts and lighthouses, the stairs wind up in a counterclockwise direction. Anyone guess why that would be? It seems more important for forts, but also apply to lighthouses. If you think of something winding, if you're on the stairs going up the wall of the lighthouse over here, there's a big void in the center where the stairway goes up. If you're defending your position, particularly if it's a fort, but even a lighthouse, we didn't have many cases where we're defending the lighthouses. But by being right-handed, you have much more of a swing to defend it. So almost all the lighthouses and many filter buildings, it winds up counterclockwise. This will be on Jeopardy, so I'm just giving you the real facts. So Situate was interesting light. I've just got a few more on lighthouses here. This one is particularly interesting. It's Minus Light. Minus Light is right off Cohasset, just a few miles offshore, and a treacherous area. You can see here, you don't see the rocks because the rock is submerged for much of the tide, just at very low tide as the rock explores. So they had light ships off there for a while. The Plymouth light, the one I just showed there in Situate, was lit to kind of, but it wasn't quite enough. So this is the approach to Boston Harbor. Up the coast just a little bit further, a few miles up, you had Boston Light to drive people in. But they needed something there. So the approach was, and it seemed good at the time, they built what they call a skeleton tower. And the waves would just wash through it. And it wouldn't have the force of the wave, it would just break the wave apart. That wasn't true. Within a year and a half, it was toppled, and the crew on board. This is it. This is not an actual photograph, but the crew was all lost. And then they decided we need to do something different. Fortunately, they brought a lightship back up for a few years, relit the one down in Situate for a while just to help out, and then rebuilt this. And it rebuilt it in a spectacular way. This was a waves breaking over it. It is if you see the entrance, sorry, just keep doing that. You see the entrance door right here. This is the little platform you go up. So you climb up a ladder to go up here. It's a little treacherous. We had some friends out there on a small boat. It was a much calmer day than this, obviously, but we were going up, and I said, I'll stay down here. You can go up the ladder, And they got up there, and they had the key to get in, and they were pushing on it. They said, it's locked. It's unlocked. It's unlocked, but I can't get into it. I said, this was Ralph and Bill. I said, pull out. They pulled out, and it comes out swing. Because if you think about it, it makes sense that the door of the side of the lighthouse, if you push it in, on a big storm, it just caved in, you had to swing it out. So that came to appreciate the logic of that. Also, I had an occasion I was taking out, if you remember Gary Studs, his admin assistant was a woman out of Cohasset that I got to know fairly well because we were dealing with them on several issues. And she said, I've lived in Cohasset my whole life. I'd like to go out to there. Can you arrange it? I said, yes, I did. So I went out with her with a boat crew. We went up, and it's pretty treacherous, again, climbing up this ladder. And she was able to go. She said, if I'd seen it beforehand, I wouldn't have begged so much to go out there. But you get up, and we went up to the top and had a great time, came back down, got back, and no injuries, got back on a boat. And as we're leaving, she said, I wasn't going to tell you this, but today was my 50th birthday. So, oh, that's really coincidental. Very happy birthday. This is an example of a light that has many interesting stories. I'll mention, some of you may be familiar with this. As I mentioned, many of the lights will flash differently. Boston light is, as I mentioned already, once every 10 seconds, it'll flash white. This one flashed 1 and then 4 times and 3 times. Very distinguishable flashing. So you can identify, it wasn't confused with Boston light, one flash, or at the time when Situate, but it was rotating due to that flash. I would maybe assume someone know the significance of that. 143. I was aware of this before, but I became aware of how sensitive it was. My watch standards came in and said, we've just had a major storm come through, and the light had been automated, and there were solar panels on the top here. The waves were breaking over the tower, and it tore the solar panels out, so the light went out. Not a big deal. As I said, navigationally, the lights weren't that critically important at this point in the 90s. We needed to get back and repair it as soon as possible. But the ice, it was winter. The ice on the ladder up there, we couldn't have gotten up there. People would have been badly injured, like people repairing it. So it was going to be a few days to get on it. We started getting all sorts of phone calls. Said, I'm here from Buffalo with my wife to reaffirm our vows. Said, what do you mean? Or I'm here to engage my wife. I'm going to propose. And I never really appreciated the fact that this day that the light went out was February 14th. And the 143 makes it the I love you light, 143. And it's known as that. And I had known that too, but I didn't really tie the issue together about Valentine's Day. Everyone understood. He said, we can't send up, they'll like get injured. They said, well, we might be able to come back, or we'll just reaffirm our vows without the light being flashing there. But so this is the I love you light. This is Hurricane Ian. We go down to Florida, a place down there, go down for usually February and March. And Ian came through and wiped out Sanibel Island. It's for those who remember, in Fort Myers Beach. We're in Bonita Springs, which didn't get hit quite as hard. But this was a lighthouse at the end of Sanibel Island. The before is on top and the after is at the bottom. Everything gone, all the buildings gone. I can see the buildings up top here, and the structure and the trees down here, everything was gone. Fortunately, the lighthouse, you can't really see it here, it lost one of its legs back in here. They were able to get some bracing in there fairly soon after the hurricane, so it never did fall over, and they were able to repair it. So now it's back in good shape now in the last 3 or 4 years. Lighthouses are typically in very dangerous places, and some of those things you can solve. This is Gay Headlight, which is the one I mentioned with that picture of the rescue off of Martha's Vineyard. This is Gay Headlight being moved back. This is several years ago. I forget when it was, 10, 12 years ago. They've had several things on TV. PBS has held the moving of this, but we try to move them back. They are iconic. They are part of our history and heritage. You know, you have to have been to sea to really appreciate some of this. And when you're out at sea for 2 or 3 weeks and you get back in, you're out of touch, particularly back in the 70s and 60s. You didn't have any good news coming. You didn't have any news, good or bad, coming. So when you're coming back into shore and see that light flashing, it's really kind of emotional. It's just civilization. It's hard to explain, but it really is significant. And of course, with people on shore too, they grew up with these lighthouses flashing. It's very important to keep them historically. And there are a lot of people. I'm not going to talk about a lot of people here, just a little bit of that. What time is it, by the way? I don't know what time. How am I doing? Okay, I'm just about through. I will end with this and open up the questions. Ida Lewis was a lightkeeper in Newport in Rhode Island, and she was phenomenal. She was not only a lightkeeper, but she did her first rescue at age 16 and did her last rescue at age 61, I think. She was a national figure. All the dignitaries would come to Newport with all the cabins there, if you will, all the mansions. We'll go down and visit her because she was so well known. This is late 1800s and very early 1900s. So again, and I haven't got time for lightships now. I'll just quickly show you. I think most of you are familiar with lightship baskets. Those were made on board the lightships just after the Civil War until 1900. Then they stopped. The federal government came in and said, the Lighthouse Service came in and said, this is a business. You can't do this here. So they started making lightship baskets on shore. But this is one that we have on exhibit here that was made on board the lightship. And they're pretty valuable now. They're several $1,000s for the originals. Although the ones they're making now are better, but don't have that history behind it. This is a quick look at the number of, as mentioned before, the number of lightships there were getting people through Nauset Bay. This one in the lower left-hand corner, the Shoals Light, right down here, was lost in a hurricane in 1944. Everyone on board was lost. Finally recovered. We know where it is now. It's a grave site now. Over here, this one, Cross Rips. Well, tell the story very quickly. Cross Rips, this was at times all of Nantucket Sound would freeze over on occasion. It hasn't happened, obviously, in the last century. But ice, I spent quite a bit of time in the Arctic. Ice is a powerful force. You think once you're frozen in ice, you're good, you'll be fine. But ice moves and it can crush a vessel very easily. And the Cross Rips light station was out there, and it was obvious they were caught in the ice. So they thought, we need to get our crew out of here. So the officer in charge at the time from the lightship walked over to, I think he walked down here to Nantucket across the ice and called up or communicated with his bosses up in Boston, the Lighthouse Service. And they said, we don't abandon a lightship. You stay there, and when it unfreezes, we'll help you get out. Well, unfortunately, they were crushed, and all the crew was lost, and it drifted out past Skankety Headlight here. They saw it going out. They had distress signals out and sank. Never been found. Sank somewhere out in here. Although I'll show you something here in a second. That's where it was, Cross Rip. This was the Vineyard Sound one that went down a hurricane. We have the lens from it. You can see the lens here. It's cracked. It's caved in the side here. That's the one that was lost in a hurricane in '44. This is Nantucket, was run over by this vessel here, which is the sister ship of the Titanic, the Olympic. And it didn't even feel it and ran over it. They did stop and help. The 12 crew on board, I think 7 of them were killed. And the captain died several months later from injuries sustained. So it's a dangerous, this is, I think, not just for Coast Guard, but in the country, what was considered at the time the most dangerous occupation you could have. It wasn't just getting run over by ships, but it's just when the ship comes out to relieve you, getting from one ship to the other and getting back ashore. Maybe not kill you, but broken leg, broken ankle. This is that Cross Rip light that was lost. Now, this is one of the last I'll show you. This is a bell that we got that was dragged off of Nauset Beach back about 20 years ago. They pulled the bell. One of the fun things about this museum is trying to determine the provenance of things we get. This was all covered with barnacles. You can see it is cleaned up here fairly well here, but in here was this little thing here. You can't really tell looking at here, but we could, through taking photos of it, changing the lighting on it, we could tell it said McShane. And McShane is a bell foundry outside in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore now, still makes bells for churches primarily. So we're able to tell that this bell was made by McShane, and they came into existence just before the Civil War. But also had another feature up on top of here, right up on top, it had this USLHE. The E was significant. The United States Lighthouse Establishment was the name of the Lighthouse Service until about 1903. I forget exactly, early 1900s. And then it became the U.S. Lighthouse Service. So the E would have been changed to S. So we were able to narrow it down a little bit more. So it's from this period. Then we talked to the McShane foundry and said, can you correct back in your records? Now we're able to go back and find out it was made in 1895, 96. And they also determined, we thought it might have been from one of the lightships, the one I said that went down, or from something else or dropped overboard. It wasn't. It was from a bellboy, a little less romantic maybe, but it was a bellboy. But this weighs about 250 pounds. I know that because I was assisting moving it upstairs, but it's another thing. It's part of our archive that comes in. I think let me just see what else is here. Oh, it wasn't at the end. This is Boston Light again. So questions for those that need to leave, go ahead, or I can answer questions for you. I have a million other slides here. I'll just give you some indication of. By the way, this one I put in here, definition of a lighthouse. This is not a lighthouse. This is a tourist attraction right on the coast. It's small, but this is a lighthouse in Greece, I believe. So it's not just the United States; they're all over the world. Spectacular lighthouses. That's a race point light on the top tip of the cape. Some of them quite spectacular. They're really fantastic piece of architecture, fantastic history. I've given talks, as she mentioned, we started out this lighthouses are fun. We give ones on we give talks on shipwrecks. I think is the next one we do here. History of the Coast Guard. Got a little touch of that just now, but also just things like women in the Coast Guard. I gave one to the women's clubs of Massachusetts the other day. And I mentioned Ida Lewis there, but there are many more. In fact, a good friend of mine is Sandy Stowes, who retired as a vice admiral, now living in Falmouth, and she was the superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy. And by that, she was the first woman to ever be the superintendent of any of the military academies. I mean, the Coast Guard Academy is quite a bit smaller than West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy, but same regulations, same requirements. Any questions at all? Or have I covered? Or I apologize for sipping through that. It would be a little smoother if I could look at my text. I probably forgot a few things. In fact, I have notes here I didn't look at. But be aware of this this mural coming out. We hope to install it in October, I think, is the date right now. The Coast Guard Academy and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which is in Kings Point, New York, meet every year for a football game. And it's called the Secondary Cup because obviously the Coast Guard now is under Homeland Security and the Merchant Marine is under Transportation. So they have this cup, the football game. It's usually at one of the alternate between two, similar to the Army Navy game or the Yale Harvard game. But this year it's going to be at Fenway Park on November 15th. So I thought well, this was a good place to show this new painting that commemorates the Coast Guard. So I thought we could make a large poster at the game. My wife, who I should point out, I met in first grade, so she's known me for a long time. 70 some odd years. She said, "It's stupid." She knows that I am stupid, so that she said, "Hey, stupid, you've got," and she's an avid Red Sox fan. She said, "They got a jumbotron there. You can just put up in the jumbotron. They can do it very easily electronically. Yes. You don't have to make something." So we're going to try to get it on the jumbotron for the game. It would be spectacular. It's a legacy painting. It's again, it has a drama. In fact, this is a just to grab the magazine away out, the Wreck and Rescue magazine, which is from the Life Saving Service organization, has a picture of it in front. It's going to get a lot more publicity as we get closer to the date of it. It's an exciting project. But I'm digressing. Any questions at all? I apologize to people listening online because my hand kept going down. You probably couldn't hear me much.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. I have a question.
Yes.
Did those Nantucket light ships all say Nantucket on them?
No, when someone, and in fact, at this point, here's the other side of the point, is that some people will say, "Oh, I saw the Nantucket light ship." I said, there isn't the Nantucket light ship because they started in the 1830s and it was the last light ship that was still commissioned with crews on board in 1985. So there was 150 years. So it wasn't the same ship. One was run over and sank. There were at least 5 or 6 of them around over the years. So no, it's not. In fact, once or twice a year, they change out the crews by bringing a boat out and changing crews out that way. But every couple of years, I should say, they're bringing the light ship in for a yard clearing or something.